Welcome back to the Project Censored Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your host, Mickey Huff. Today in this segment, we are honored to welcome back to the program some amazing folks from the Freedom of the Press Foundation. Freedom.press is the website. And of course, you'll hear from both Seth Stern, who's been on our program before, as well as Lauren Harper. Let me start by introducing Lauren to everyone. Lauren is Freedom of the Press Foundation's first Daniel Ellsberg Chair on Government Secrecy. Congratulations, absolutely in order. Project Censored, longtime friends, colleagues with Daniel Ellsberg and in support of his work. And so it's an honor to have Lauren Harper on as the first Daniel Ellsberg Chair on Government Secrecy with the Freedom of the Press Foundation. This position was established to honor and continue the legendary whistleblower's fight for secrecy reform. Lauren joins Freedom of the Press Foundation after a decade fighting excessive government secrecy with Washington, D.C. based nonprofit, the National Security Archive. There, Lauren served as public policy director and helped historians, journalists, and the public win the declassification of historically significant government documents. Lauren holds a master's in public policy and a master's in Middle Eastern studies, both from the University of Chicago. Lauren Harper, welcome to the Project Censored Show.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
As an historian and a journalist, I couldn't be more delighted to welcome you to the program. And of course, welcome back to the program to Seth Stern. Seth is the director of advocacy at Freedom of the Press Foundation, oversees their efforts to promote policies that protect press freedom and stand up for journalists and whistleblowers who have been denied their rights. Prior to joining Freedom of the Press Foundation, Seth practiced media and First Amendment law in Chicago for more than a decade. Before that, he worked as a reporter and editor in the Chicago and Atlanta areas. He now lives in Chicago. Seth Stern, welcome back to the Project Censored Show.
Always great to be here.
Lauren Harper, since it's your first time on the show, and you are the first Daniel Ellsberg Chair on Government Secrecy, it just sounds like an amazing position to me. Can you talk to me about what's been happening, what you've been doing there? You've been in there a little more than half a year, I believe, correct?
Yes, time has flown, and it has absolutely been a dream job. You know, stuff like this, for those of us who are interested in secrecy, these opportunities don't come up very often. And the mandate of the job that I take really seriously is to show how secrecy causes harm. I think that's been kind of one of the problems in getting more people to substantively talk about secrecy and report on it consistently is because it's typically very difficult to show how keeping something secret causes a direct harm to the public. And obviously, you know, being in this position during the Trump administration, which has taken a lot of secrecy actions. You know, certainly Trump isn't the only president to be secretive, but he has certainly done some things that are very unique in his first about month in office, has provided, I think, a really good opportunity to talk about not only the individual things that are happening right now that could harm the public, but also kind of the systems in place, whether that's rules around classification, et cetera, the Espionage Act and things like that, and how that harms reporters and the public who rely on that reporting.
Well, Lauren, just very briefly, just maybe mention a few things about Daniel Ellsberg. Of course, Ellsberg, known for the Pentagon Papers and, the Supreme Court case that Nixon lost with the New York Times in the early 1970s. Legendary and iconic whistleblower, but was also vehemently anti-war, pro-peace, and spoke out a lot against nuclear proliferation, the dangers of atomic wars. We are now closer, according to the atomic clock and the scientists that look at that. They've raised it even 2 seconds closer to midnight. The fact that we are now staring down the prospects of annihilating ourselves and the planet. I find myself pining for the days when Iron Maiden sang about 2 minutes to midnight in the 1980s. We're down to, what is it now? I think it's 88 seconds or something.
Wow.
At any rate, Lauren, maybe mention just a few things about the late, great Dan Ellsberg and, whose position is named is named for.
Yeah, I mean, you certainly mentioned some extremely important ones. I also follow the atomic clock and how close we are to midnight. But I think one of the most important things about Dan that I try to think about is, he took positions that were consistent and principled, regardless of whether or not that they were popular. And I think that that's something that's really important for us to do now more than ever. It's very easy for folks, I think, to get in the habit of, whether it's intentional or not, of developing a position where it's difficult to agree when, another party is doing something right, even if it does consistently fit in that position. And I think FOIA and secrecy is a great example. It used to be the Freedom of Information Act in particular, has historically been an area where you've seen bipartisan support because everybody knows, if one administration takes advantage of a tool, the next administration will do the same thing. So I think I think about that a lot when I'm doing a gut check on, policy proposals that may come out of the Trump administration. Is this something that I would agree with if it were coming from a previous administration? So I think taking the principle of something, even when it's unpopular, is perhaps one of Dan's most important legacies that I try and work with every day.
Well, absolutely, and such a great point to bring up, and so well put. More than a decade ago, Dan wrote a piece for us at Project Censored on civil courage. He talked about, how as a nation we like to talk about the courage of our military or soldiers purportedly fighting to protect freedoms and so on. But Dan said civil courage was something that he thought was even more rare, and that was, people that have positions maybe in government that find themselves torn between conscience, right, and maybe loyalty to a position. And
Mhm.
interestingly, Dan said that we need far more whistleblowers and far more people speaking out about conscience and about the things that they see. And of course, Dan not only led by example, but he was a great supporter of the many whistleblowers of our time, from Edward Snowden to Julian Assange and many others. So very important work that you're doing. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about FOIA. Also want to get your take on Doge and a few other things that are happening in Trump's whirlwind here, his first month in office. But Seth Stern, I wanted to come back to you here and welcome you to the conversation to address one of the things that you and I often talk about when you're on the program. The previous Trump administration certainly made a name for itself in attacks on the press and attacks on journalists. And during the campaign, that seemed to ramp back up again. And here we are about a month in. Can you, and I know that you all do the fantastic press freedom tracker. Andy Lee Roth and I cite it almost every year in the Project Censored work. Absolutely essential and extraordinary work that you all do protecting journalists. Can you talk a little bit about where we are, maybe some of the current issues? I know there was the fiasco with the AP. There's been the kicking out of different groups from the Pentagon. Can you talk a little bit about the state of the free press according to the Freedom Tracker and what's happening with the Trump administration thus far? Seth Stern.
Sure. Well, a whole lot has already happened with the Trump administration, and my fear is that there is a week that is going to be devoted to attacking the press, and that week has not even come yet, that these are all sort of previews of what's to come, the same way he had a week where he seemed to be entirely focused on undocumented people. One day there will be a week where he unleashes his onslaught on the press, and I hope it's when I'm not on vacation because there's going to be a lot to do. Um, but yes, so far we have seen, I think most notably, the weaponization of the FCC under the new chair, Brendan Carr, who has made very clear in his public statements that his intention is to be Trump's chief censor. The one that's gotten the most headlines probably is CBS because it relates to the lawsuit that President Trump has pending against CBS for editing the Kamala Harris interview. The FCC also has a complaint open and is essentially claiming authority to regulate how news networks edit interviews, and whether or not you agree with how CBS edited the interview, that's absurd and contrary to everything the First Amendment stands for. But in lesser known cases, he's actually gone further than that. There was a case in San Francisco involving a local radio station that covered an ICE raid. And in the course of that coverage, repeated publicly known information about the general area where the raid took place and the cars that ICE agents were driving. And the FCC's response to that was to investigate based on the theory that they had identified ICE agents, which they didn't, but they were constitutionally entitled to do. And the claim being that FCC licensees, because to broadcast on the airwaves, aside from cable, you do need to be licensed from the FCC. The theory that they're obligated to operate in the public interest, which that's true. That is what the code says. But historically, the FCC has been aware that there is tension between the rules under which they operate and the First Amendment, and they've been very cautious about not claiming inappropriate authority. So the idea that the public interest clause allows the FCC, the government, to decide what news is in the public's interest to hear, and then punish those who broadcast news they don't think the public should hear, that's really alarming. And as you said, we're early on. There's no telling where else it'll go from here. The AP fiasco has gotten a lot of press in the last week or so. It's for good reason. The Associated Press continued referring to the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of Mexico after Trump decided it was called the Gulf of America. I don't even know if that was necessarily a principled stand by the AP as much as that globally it is recognized as the Gulf of Mexico, and they dispatch their wire stories to news outlets all over the place. If they dispatch a story that sells Gulf of America, people not even who aren't following Trump's latest shenanigans won't know what they're talking about. But in any event, Trump has barred them from access to things like executive order signings and press briefings until they get in line and start calling the Gulf of Mexico Gulf of America. Petty, ridiculous, comical, except that it is such an egregious violation of the First Amendment to claim the power to punish content decisions, literal word choices, by news outlets. Of course, Trump is entitled to decide who gets access to a signing session, but not on the basis of what they publish. So it's quite disturbing. And as I've said, my hope is that there is a bright side to the story, that everyone who is not allowed to attend Trump's latest Sharpie signing session will instead go back to their desks and investigate the administration and find a better use of their time than watching ceremonies and stunts.
One would hope. Lauren, come on back in here.
Yeah, I mean, these cases are so interesting, and I'm thinking about the ABC settled
Yes.
a defamation lawsuit in particular. And the thing that I found so egregious about that, Seth's obviously right about everything he said, but the money, I think it was $16 million, went to what was widely reported as Trump's presidential library. And this is not actually true. The money went to the establishment of a presidential foundation and museum. Now, as anybody knows, if you are an avid follower of presidential foundations and their relationship with the National Archives, these presidential foundations can do almost anything that they want with that money. And they have been accused of being set up to avoid what would normally be considered campaign disclosure requirements. So it certainly adds insult to injury where this money is going sometimes.
Not only that, but the ABC is setting, in my view, a bad precedent by settling and not, going through the process here over what almost looks to amount to semantics, with Stephanopoulos in that case. And then, of course, CBS looks like they're on the verge of settling around editing. And part of the tactic here is the Trump lawyers are not going after these outlets for defamation, but they're ironically going after under consumer protection as they also dismantle these other agencies and so on. Lauren or Seth, do you want to talk about the tactic that the Trump administration is taking legally to silence the media?
I'll let Seth tackle that.
Yeah, well, the ABC settlement, you're exactly right. It was a matter of semantics, and I wrote an op-ed for my hometown paper, the Chicago Sun-Times, back when I was practicing law, I litigated essentially the same case. A Northwestern professor who was accused of sexual assault was referenced in a headline as having been accused of rape. He sued, he lost, because according to Webster's dictionary, according to the law, rape and sexual assault are essentially synonymous. And to win in a lawsuit, you have to prove that you were damaged. Essentially, to win that case, Trump would have to prove that there was someone who wanted to do business with him who understood he was an accused sexual abuser. But when they read that he was an accused rapist, they said, well, that crosses the line. I only do business with sexual abusers, not with rapists. Find me the person who thinks that way. They don't exist. So the concern there becomes that the reason ABC is settling is not that there was legal merit to the case or real liability risk. It's because ABC and Disney, its parent company that has interests far beyond the news industry, wanted to be on the good side of the Trump administration. And you see the same thing with CBS, which has a merger it wants to get approved. And actually, the other day there was reporting, I believe in the Wall Street Journal, that Paramount executives might be having cold feet about settling with Trump because they're concerned that their shareholders could then sue them for entering into an improper settlement, which, look, all's well that ends well. And if they don't settle for that reason, I'm happy with that. But it's pretty unfortunate when the only reason that news publishers won't bribe the president for favorable treatment is because they're afraid they'll get sued. There should be some principles involved, which appear to be entirely lost. So it's difficult to say whether this tactic of essentially extorting news outlets through the court system, of extracting bribes and saying it's okay because there's a judge in the room who signs off on it, how much of that we're going to see. I think that those who regulate the legal industry, attorney disciplinary commissions, judges who have the power to enter sanctions, historically, they're very reluctant to exercise those powers for a combination of good reasons and bad ones, but they need to rise to the moment. When courts are being abused as essentially protection rackets to extract bribes, we can't just resort to old norms and processes and say, okay, this is normal. My hands are tied. The parties have reached a private settlement. I'm going to rubber stamp on it. No, someone needs to say something. And hopefully they will. You also asked about the consumer fraud angle. Yeah, that is a trend that Trump, Musk, Ken Paxton, others have been attempting. Legally frivolous, that's well established. You can't circumvent protections for speech that are embodied in defamation law by calling your claim something else. People used to try it with intentional infliction of emotional distress. Now it's consumer fraud. Those protections are not some quirk of defamation law. They're rooted in the First Amendment. It doesn't matter what label you put on it. And what's kind of ironic to me when you talk about Musk specifically is you see him now posting lies about Reuters and Politico, claiming that non-news related products they operate, for better or worse, not endorsing any of those products, but claiming that payments are going essentially to bribe Reuters and Politico, when instead, under contracts signed by Trump, payments are going to entirely separate entities. That is a lot closer to consumer fraud than anything Musk is calling consumer fraud.
It's absolutely extraordinary, just the list of things you went over, Seth. And, interestingly enough, I thought I was maybe in a business seminar or an econ class, even though we're talking about journalism. No mention of the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics. No mention of journalistic integrity outside of mentioning the First Amendment. Seems like these are all business and legal decisions. And I think that we need to infuse a little bit more about the role journalism plays in our republic, and it absolutely deserves to be defended more robustly, particularly when under such attack. And Lauren Harper, we want to bring you back into the conversation and shift a little bit. Before the break, Seth Stern brought up Elon Musk and some of the many things that Elon is doing at the behest of the Trump administration. One of the things that I wanted to talk to you about, and maybe you can help us understand and our audience understand, the mighty Doge. What exactly is going on with this so-called Department of Government Efficiency? What authority does Musk have? What are he and his adolescent pranksters doing in government? I mean, can you help unpack this and talk about the legality of it at all?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, to start, like, we don't even know if Musk is technically a federal employee. He said that he is, not leading Doge, even though Trump has said that he's leading Doge. And the opacity in general is part of the problem. But Doge, more broadly, is established in executive order. The executive order leaves some stuff to be desired in terms of the structure of Doge. What it says is that Doge is going to be a reestablishment and realignment of something called the United States Digital Service, which existed in the executive office of the president as part of OMB. Now, apparently, it's being moved out of OMB into another part of the executive office of the president, well, where it will report directly to the White House Chief of Staff, Susie Wiles. Now, this may not seem all that interesting, but one of the things that this may do is mean that Doge is not subject to the Freedom of Information Act, which OMB is, and instead is subject to the Presidential Records Act. Now, this has a couple important points. Under the Presidential Records Act, you can't file a FOIA request, for example, for what on earth Doge is up to until 5 years after the end of the presidential administration, which means you can't file a FOIA request for whatever Doge is doing until, check my math, but 2034. There are some additional things to keep in mind here, which is that the Presidential Records Act, as we may recall from Trump's first term, is nearly impossible to enforce in real time. There's nobody outside of the executive office of the president and his immediate staff who can ensure that they are preserving their records. So this is a big picture problem. The other thing is we just don't know what Doge is doing within agencies. For example, USAID. We don't know what Doge is doing with their records. There have been reports at various places throughout the government, like OPM, for example, that Doge is installing commercial software to take ownership of agency records. So this brings in questions about, who is actually owning the federal records? Does OPM in that instance still have access to and control of those records? Or are they now Doge records on Doge servers, which is not supposed to happen under the Federal Records Act? The Federal Records Act makes very clear that federal records have to stay on federal systems. And if they are being transferred out of, let's say, federal agency control and into Doge's hands, does that mean in those instances that those records are now subject to the PRA and not the FOIA? So there are a lot of big picture questions about what on earth Doge is doing, how it's set up, and what is happening with the ownership of the records and data sets that it is taking possession of.
So, Lauren Harper, I have to imagine that there are groups of people, lawyers, judges, others, yeah, obviously you all, uh, looking into this. Um, how exactly how is this happening? Sorry to have such a strange question, but this is pretty extraordinary, is it not?
It's absolutely extraordinary, and part of the problem is we are not inside those agencies. We don't know how it's happening because those agencies aren't directly communicating with the public. For example, you look at the health agencies at HHS and stuff like that that have these gag orders on communications with the public. That exacerbates the problem. There are certainly groups that are going to court that are challenging what Doge is doing. I've seen cases brought under the Administrative Procedures Act, cases brought specifically against Doge under the Freedom of Information Act to try and say, even if you're claiming you're a Presidential Records Act entity, you can't actually be one because you're doing more than just advising the president. So there are people who are filing their suits in court to try and, uncover exactly what Doge is up to. But one of the concerns that I have from a preservation and access perspective is, courts still move relatively slowly, and they're certainly not moving as quickly as folks at Doge. So my immediate concern is what's happening with the records right now especially at agencies where perhaps you're not seeing suits filed just yet, that perhaps because they haven't reached, the USAID, CFPB level of public awareness. And it's a problem. There's no real-time oversight.
No, Lauren, just a couple. I mean, there have been so many things coming at us with the actions of the incoming Trump administration. A couple of seemingly alarming things that happen involved in the nuclear agency, new regulators, people involved in nukes, and also the hay being made about allegedly just throngs of dead people getting Social Security payments because these kids don't know how to read what's going on with government records. Can you at
Yes.
least address some of those briefly? I know there's a longer list of things, but those are two things that spring to mind.
Yeah, I mean, to me, if I may, I think the biggest problem that we have in terms of Doge and records access across the government, and whether people being fired, et cetera, is what's going on with the National Archives. There was a story that ended up being true, although the timing was a little bit off, about Marco Rubio being named the acting archivist of the United States, and a guy named Jim Byron is his senior advisor. Now, Jim Byron, for those who don't know, is the CEO of the Nixon Foundation. He's allegedly taken a step back from the Nixon Foundation to work for the State Department. But so there's been a purge at the National Archives over the past week, 2 weeks. And this is important because the National Archives basically sets records management rules across the federal agencies. And at the same time, we are seeing the firing of FOIA officials at places like OPM and probably a lot of other agencies. So we're getting to a point just broadly where, not only are there not going to be, perhaps there may not be staff to respond to FOIA requests, but also we're going to reach a point where people in government don't know what records exist and where they are because those agencies conducting oversight have been gutted. So it's a large scale problem that I think we are really on the precipice of being forced to confront. And that's, we're seeing that, with the story that you mentioned about, the nuclear regulatory agency folks being fired and then folks at Doge realizing, oh no, we actually shouldn't have done this. So we're seeing large scale firing of personnel who are critical to all these functions. I think one of the questions will be, will the remedy, of course, for example, say, no, you have to rehire these people, will that happen in time to prevent long-term damage and perhaps a lot of records being lost? And I'm not sure that courts can act that quickly.
That sounds extraordinary in terms of the magnitude of the crisis that is being created. And FOIA historically isn't exactly a fast process.
Correct.
We could talk to Jason Leopold about
Yeah.
that. Any others?
Yeah.
I know y'all are no strangers to the FOIA process, but that's already an issue. And then there's
Mhm.
denial and all kind of things. Seth Stern, what do you see? I mean, I think I know the answer to this, but net effect of these things for press freedom and for journalists.
It's early on to predict the net effect. Press freedom has been on the decline in the United States for some time. Before the Trump administration, you mentioned the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker. The tracker documents press freedom violations across the country, not just at the federal level. And if you look there, you'll see that press freedom is under threat everywhere, blue or red states, Democrat, Republican administrations. Just today, the major incident making news is from Mississippi, but a Democratic part of Mississippi. And what happened there was a city, Clarksdale, filed suit against a newspaper for defamation over an editorial. This editorial, it was about the most bland, non-defamatory, small town news editorial you'll ever see. And not only that, but they sought an injunction requiring the newspaper to take down the editorial, practically unheard of in the United States. And a judge granted it. Really, really alarming stuff. That doesn't happen often. We've seen a rise in prior restraints that I think we've discussed on the show previously. Most of them, though, are clawback orders to seek returns of government records that reporters got their hands on, aimed at particular pieces of information that were published, all very problematic. But the idea of a judge in the United States ordering a takedown of an entire editorial that has not been adjudicated defamatory, even if it had, that's hardly any better, without even a hearing or any process, really raises alarms of when it comes to the state of the judiciary. And when you hear people saying the judiciary is sort of the last, the last obstacle, what needs to hold in order to restrain this administration, that does not paint an optimistic picture of where things are going. And it all ties back to the demise of local news in my mind, because the reason these judges don't know the first thing about the First Amendment is that they don't see any First Amendment cases because there are no newspapers. Years ago, whether a judge had a particular interest in the First Amendment or not, they were going to be forced to familiarize themselves with it because cases involving the local paper would be in front of them every so often, and they'd have to go back and reread what they learned in law school and probably slept through. But that doesn't happen anymore. So you've got, and of course, that's not to say that the decision in Clarksdale or anywhere else is sheerly a product of incompetence. It's entirely possible that there's also corruption involved. But to the extent that it's incompetence, I think that's why. So when you've got a media and a judiciary that are in this state of disrepair, plus you've got the Trump administration attacking it from angles that haven't been seen before, adding to the existing playbook of attacks against the press, it does not paint a promising picture for the future.
No, certainly not. And Lauren, let's bring you back and conclude the segment with you, Lauren.
Yeah, I mean, at the same time, we've also got an administration that's purporting to be transparent. Certainly claiming to be the most transparent in history, and it's
And fighting for free speech.
and fighting for free speech. And I think one of the things that we should keep in mind when we see any administration's claim, but certainly this administration's claim that they are being transparent, is to look at what they're actually doing. And I think a good example might be when the CIA, under its new director, John Ratcliffe, declassified its low confidence assessment that COVID-19 originated in a lab as opposed to a market, while at the same time, health agencies at HHS were told that they couldn't communicate with the public. So I think this is an example of selective transparency. So when an administration is saying they want to declassify assassination records, therefore we're transparent, or, we release this, therefore we're transparent, I think it's on us to reiterate that no, what we have to have is a whole of government approach to transparency. I think that's going to be really critical.
Well, absolutely. And this is, of course, why we need organizations like Freedom of the Press Foundation, keeping, watchdogs, keeping an eye on this, actually helping people understand the threats that we face. And again, it's always wonderful to check in with you all. Seth Stern, Director of Advocacy at Freedom of the Press Foundation, and of course, Lauren Harper, the first Daniel Ellsberg Chair on Government Secrecy at Freedom of the Press Foundation. You can go to freedom.press online to learn more. And something tells me, Seth and Lauren, that I'm going to be reaching out to you and have you back on for more regular appearances, because there's an awful lot to keep up with. And I can't think of two folks that really kind of, are paying attention to it closely enough and really have your fingers on the pulse of what's happening and really helping us understand the significance of it all. So Seth and Lauren, thanks so much for what you do. And thank you certainly for coming on the Project Censored Show today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks. Looking forward to being back.